There are a lot of different deadlift variations, but a lot of people don't know when to use specific variations and why in order to improve certain types of movement and load certain tissues. So in this video, I'm going to break down two of my favorite hinging variations, explain when to use them, why to use them, and why they are more effective earlier on in the training sequence for your clients. Hi, I'm Alex Effer, founder of Resilient Training and Rehab. I've helped thousands of coaches and clinicians get better and more consistent results with their clients. Let's get into it. So one of my favorite exercises, especially early on when teaching somebody how to hinge, is the knee to wall foam roller hinge. This came about because I was working with one of these clients who, no matter what I did, because they were so stiff, they just couldn't get into a good position or feel the right muscles. Every time they were doing a hinge, they feel their lower back, or they would feel their quad or something like that because they just couldn't sit back into the hip. And so using this front on knee to the wall foam roller hinge was a game changer for him, so many other clients, because it really reinforces certain positions of the pelvis. So the difference between this kind of hinge and something like a kickstand hinge or a bilateral hinge is that what it's going to do is reinforce the ability for the hip to internally rotate. So one of the main things that we need to appreciate is when we're doing an effective hinge, we need the femur to be able to internally rotate so then the pelvis can roll over top of it, right? A lot of times what you'll see is you'll see people shifting their hips back too fast and they don't have the ability to internally rotate this hip, and that's when you start to see the knees hyperextend, the back arch as soon as somebody bends over. And so it's important that we can restore some of this internal rotation of the hip so that the pelvis can now start to roll forward versus shift back excessively. And so by having the knee into the foam roller, what it does is it puts my hip into 90 degrees of hip flexion, which biases more internal rotation of the femur, kicks on muscles like my anterior glute med, my inside hamstring, the adductors that influence the femur's ability to move. And then what it does is it pushes the femur back into the socket, right? So what we need to do for internal rotation to happen is we need the femur to be able to roll back into the socket. A lot of times people have pelvis that's tilted forward or they have really tight glutes or squeezed glutes. And so what happens is the femur rolls forward in the socket and this space between the femur and the sit bone gets closed. So think of like the piriformis and the deep glutes. They pull everything together and they get this really stiff back part of the pelvis. And so when people, again, when they bend over, they just shift their hips back excessively or they hyperextend their knees. And so by having the knee at 90 degrees, that opens up the space in the back part of the hip, which is also called the posterior capsule. And when they bend over, now they can maintain this internal rotation position and allow the pelvis to move more freely, which is then going to reinforce that hinging position. So this knee to wall foam roller is an exercise I like to use as a starting point, whether it's in the warm-up, whether it's in the strength program, just to pattern the movement and reinforce the movement so that when we start progressing the deadlift, we can now start to make sure we got the right mechanics involved. So again, this movement is going to reinforce more of the femur's ability to internally rotate, which is great for somebody who wants to decelerate or have their foot in front of them in something like a split squat, or they get pinching in the front part of their hip because they're missing that motion of the hip. So let's break down the movement now and go through the cues that you would use in order to effectively perform this movement. So when performing an effective hinge, there are two main things we need to consider. First, we want to make sure that the knee stays in a flexed position or a bent position. Again, when you see people, when they do a hinge, they like to hyperextend their knees excessively. And what that does, that closes that back part of the hip. By keeping the knee flexed over top of the knuckles or the end of the laces of the shoe, that's going to keep that back part of the hip open. So that's what the foam roller is meant to do. The foam roller is meant to maintain that knee flexion, allow the pelvis to roll around it. If you hyperextend your knees, the foam roller is going to fall. So it gives us that cue of constantly pushing our knee into the foam roller which is going to maintain that knee flexion. The other thing that we need to think about is not only just pushing the knee into the foam roller, but make sure we are anchoring our heels. If I just push my knee into the foam roller, a lot of times you'll just kind of lean over to your toes, again, squeezing the glute. We want to be thinking about pushing the knee into the foam roller, anchoring the heel down. That's going to kick on that glute and the hamstring. And the third thing for an effective hinge and for this movement is I don't want to think about shifting my hip back. You can see how the foam roller already fell. Instead, what I want you to think about doing is pushing into the foam roller, pushing your heel down, and then just thinking about bowing over top. Don't shift your hips back, but just think about rotating your hips forward. And what that's going to do is that's going to reinforce the glutes' ability to stretch as I go down and then push into the foam roller as I come up. So now that glute can actually contract. Now, ideally, I want a longer foam roller, obviously, because my head's going to hit the wall. But if I can push the knee into the foam roller on both phases, as I go down, I'm pushing into the foam roller. As I come up, I'm pushing the foam roller. I'm going to get a lot of glute activity, and I'm going to reinforce those mechanics. So now we're going to progress into the side-on hinge. Both of them are going to have different types of impact at the hip and what we're trying to improve. So, as we said, the front on is going to improve the femur's ability to internally rotate. But now what we have to do is improve someone's ability to open up the space between the sacrum and the sit bone. Okay, so when I'm hinging, I need the femur to internally rotate, like we said, which is with the first movement. And when I bend over, I need to make sure this space is open. Oftentimes, people who have really squeezed glutes, so the sacrum and sit bone get closer together, when they bend over, that's when you start to see them arching their back or flaring their ribs as they descend. Or what they'll do is they'll just kind of fold over. So if you see the people who are very mobile, you'll see they just look like they fold right over, so their back stays flat the entire time, and they swing their chest towards their knees, right? So that's somebody, again, who's maintained this closed position. Instead, in order to get these glutes to lengthen, I need to be able to maintain that internal rotation, open up the space, so now my pelvis can fold forward. Now, usually when I cue an exercise with a hinge, I'll make sure that their arm goes below knee level. I don't need them to get towards the ground necessarily. If I want to reinforce this motion, then I'm going to want to, as I cued in the other exercise, just let the pelvis fold forward. But what the deadlift coming side on is going to do is it's going to cause this femur to adduct. So not only internally rotate, but adduct. So now what has to happen is my pelvis now naturally has to turn towards that side, right? And so if I turn towards that side, then this space will start to get larger. Because as I turn towards the side, I'm going to have to open up that glute in the back side of the pelvis. Otherwise, what you're going to do is just try to dump the pelvis forward, right? And so when I'm performing this movement, I'm going to internally rotate, adduct, which just means bring the thigh towards the middle, and then I'm going to turn towards it to reinforce the opening of that space. So the first movement was about internal rotation of the femur. The second movement is all about restoring that sacrum's ability to move away from the sit bone, which is key for hip extension. So if somebody's limited in hip extension, this is the variation that I would go for. Okay, so as I mentioned, by having the foam roller into the wall, I'm gonna have to bring the thigh towards the middle more. I'm gonna have to push inwards with the thigh to hold the foam roller. So what that is going to do is that's gonna get my adductor or my groin muscle to kick on, and more specifically, the extension muscles of the adductor, which is why this exercise is going to help with that hip extension. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to make sure, again, my knee is over towards the knuckles of my toes. I'm then going to press the inside arch of my foot into the ground and dig or press the knee into the foam roller. I'm then going to grab the dumbbell on the opposite arm, and I'm going to think about the same cues I did before. I'm going to think about just bowing over top as I maintain that pressure, and I'm going to feel a stretch in the glute, but actually in a different area. I'm going to feel it a little bit more central versus the first exercise. I was feeling a little bit more lower glutes. So now this is more of my mid glute and the upper part of the glute. And as I come up, again, I'm driving that knee forward and driving the hip forward. So now I'm getting a lot of glute activity, a lot of hamstring, pressing the foam roller into the wall. But what you'll see is my foot's not like that pushing into the wall. I don't want this valgus knee. I want to make sure that the foot, knee, and hip, or the second toe or third toe, knee, and hip are lined up. Not going like that. That's not what I want. I want everything stacked underneath or over top that left foot. I'm not going to turn excessively like so. I'm just going to make sure everything is facing straight ahead. And then I'm going to slowly lower as I come up, pressing through the inside part of the foot, driving the knee forward, driving the hip forward. As we discussed, there's so many different deadlift variations. These two are some of my favorite ones just to reinforce the right position, getting the right muscles working, and adding constraints in place to make sure that they are performing those movements well. Because again, a lot of times people will overly cue exercises and it becomes very confusing on what to do. Whereas if I just put the foam roller in the knee, you have to hold the foam roller up. So it's minimal cueing, but it reinforced the right position. So if these exercises help, give it a try. Don't forget to comment below. Let me know how it goes. And don't forget to like, save, and subscribe. And I'll see you next time.